What's going on, guys? One of the feelings that if you're never feeling, it means that you're not doing very well, is that hollow emptiness after you bluff off a stack and get called and lose a whole buy-in. If this is a rare guest in your game, if this is something that you try to avoid at all costs, then you, my friend, are playing far too tight. There are many spots, which we talk about in our exploitative course, Cash Injection, and sometimes in these free YouTube videos as well, which are very overfolded by even people at quite reasonable stakes, by even quite competent regs, not to mention the kind of weaker humdrum regs that play 10NL or 25NL. They're just not going to hit defense frequencies in those spots, and those are the spots in which it's really important to make sure that you're bluffing enough in, not just bluffing enough, but actually bluffing too much in. That's right, you want to be more aggressive than GTO in theory would indicate that you should be in those spots. I believe this spot here is one such spot. It was played this morning at 200 zoom in a 4-bet pot. Let's get into the action. This is a great example of where you need to be bluffing off a stack, and I'll show you why with a solver output in just a second. And it's funny because the solver doesn't actually like my play, but yet I'm going to use the solver output to justify the play. Sound weird? Keep watching, I'll show you how that works. So we open to 2.5, 2.25 BBs with ace 4 of spades in the cutoff. So we're 3-bet to a normal size here of 11 big blinds. The big blind folds and we 4-bet to 24.8 BBs, just making up the sizing here as I go. This hand, according to my sim, is allowed to 4-bet, it's also allowed to call. It's actually really close between all of the different options pre-flop, so it's not really a big deal. As you can see here, the hand that's highlighted at the top right is our hand ace 4 suited, and it basically does all three options. I don't have the EV on screen for this hand, but those of you who are a little bit versed in game theory and poker theory in general will know that when all three options are being mixed into a strategy, the EV for those options must be the same. So basically it's minus 2.5 big blinds here or minus 2.25 big blinds here, depending on how big you open, regardless of what you do. This is how game theory works. It kind of makes people indifferent with a subset of hands, and this is one of them that is just the way Villain is playing, the way he's shoving, flatting, folding against his 4-bet. Makes this hand just good enough to 4-bet bluff, but not something you have to do, and actually something that if you do this all the time, you're going to be over bluffing and opening yourself up to being jammed on too wide, but that never happens anyway, so who actually cares? So yeah, this 4-bet is fine. I would recommend you use this 4-bet more than the solver does at your games. Reason being, I don't think people shove enough to punish you for it. I don't think you're ever going to get exploited. And if anything, people are just going to fold too often. They're going to be uncomfortable playing the 4-bet pots that ensue when they're supposed to flat as well. And in this situation, I think this is a very big fold equity spot in general, actually. So Villain, who appears to be a solid reg, running 24-19 over 954 hands. Don't know much about this player. You guys probably know more. You always do. You guys are always like, oh yeah, Joe Black. I know Joe Black. He's been a reg for like 15 years. And I'm like, I don't know who you're talking about, but okay. You guys seem to know the pool. I think you guys sit there and actually study the pool and take notes on them. You're like some kind of pool specialist. So I'm sure you'll let me know in the comments who this player is and what they had for breakfast today. We decide to go for 1/5 to 1/4 pot small c-bet here. Gonna bet all of our range. The reason for this is a Jack 7-5 with a flush draw. It's a very good board for our range. If you think about Jack X combos, most of them are going to be folding to our 4-bet. A few of them can flat, like maybe Ace Jack suited can creep in here. King Jack suited can probably creep in here. Other than that, there's not going to be a ton of them. There might be a few other suited broadways at a low frequency with a jack in it, but overall this is a board that preserves the strength of the overpairs that are very much our sort of hand here, and also our Jack X is going to be more abundant. We're going to be 4-bet bluffing a little bit of maybe Ace Jack off, possibly things like some suited jacks as well from time to time, although we'll flat most of those. But we have a monopoly on the very big hands here. We connect with this sometimes with our bluffing region, and overall we just have less hands like pocket 6s and pocket 9s in our range, which are of course not great things to have here. Villain has more of those. So we bet range here. I'm going to show you the sim in just a second, but this range bet is very normal. The queen turn is a fantastic card for our range. If you think about the sort of thing Villain would fold on the flop, it would be like the king queen of hearts, the ace queen of clubs, the ace queen of hearts, that sort of thing. So this is a card that really just hits our bluffing range. It hits our queen X. It also hits some hands like ace king, which pick up extra equity here, ace 10. So overall, this is a card that you can actually go ahead in 3-bet pots and 4-bet pots alike and kind of range bet again on cards like this. Range betting a second time after your first bet gets called is not normally something we recommend, because the caller of the flop c-bet usually strengthens, condenses, gains some kind of equity advantage against our range in these situations. And indeed that is what's happening here. But in a 4-bet pot, the ranges are very asymmetrical, meaning that Villain just has a massive monopoly on sort of pocket 10s, pocket 9s, pocket 8s, and we have the huge monopoly on overpairs and big cards at this point in the hand. What that really leads to is a situation where on some turns, villain's range does amazingly well. So like on an 8th turn, it's possible he should even build leads. On a turn like a king or a queen, or to a lesser extent maybe an ace as well, we are going to be the ones in the driver's seat. Our range equity is going to catapult its way to being higher than villains again, and we're going to want to do a ton of betting once again here. So it doesn't matter that we have better bluffs, it doesn't matter that you would rather have a gutter, that you would feel more comfortable with that comfort blanket of a gut shot. Don't wait around for situations that are better for you to bluff when you have a very plus EV bluff here. I go for a very small bet here. This is a bet that does actually force pool to defend under pair a second time at quite a large frequency. I feel like this bet's already going to be very overfolded too, because if you imagine villain's range here, they're not going to arrive on this node with that much queen X or jack X. They're hardly ever going to have a set or anything better than that. They're not going to have ace king, that's going to jam preflop usually, and they're not going to have too many combos of pocket aces or kings or something like that, although I think they're allowed to slow play aces from time to time on this node, so that could exist. There could be a little bit of ace queen, but I think that's the sort of thing that's going to fold the flop at the highest frequency of all the hands they're going to have here. So I think this is a very lucrative bet. If you think about betting quarter pot, you know, your opponent's going to need to defend the vast majority of their range to stop you just printing from that. If they're folding, in fact, more than 20% of the time to this, they're already just giving you automatically profitable bluffs, which is okay. You know, this is a great card for your range, and maybe your bluff should be automatically profitable here to some extent. It's a fallacy that the bluffer, would-be bluffer, should always be indifferent to bluffing, not when their range is thriving as it is here. So while villain probably doesn't want to make us indifferent here, they do need to defend a ton of their range, and I think that's going to be super hard to do, as we'll see in just a second when we pull up the sim here. So villain calls, we head on over to the 8 of Hearts River, which is a card that hits pocket 8s. I think that's one of the more likely pocket pairs to fold, it being more vulnerable to our bluffing range. For example, if we had something like ace 10 or king 10 here, then something like 8s would actually be giving us 2 overcards, whereas 10s wouldn't. So probably villain should rather call 10s and 8s, but it's going to be close. We get to this river, villain checks again. Not only here, when we jam, is our opponent going to have to defend all of their queen X and jack X, but they're going to have to mix in some bluff catcher calls with 9s again, giving us credit for blasting ace king enough of the time. Ace 4, hands like this, ace 4 of spades in particular. The solver is like, no, this is the bad one. This is the one you're not allowed to bluff. And if we care too much about that, we're going to go delirious. We're just going to become insane very quickly, because it's a very specific meta GTO thing that's completely dependent on people playing suits in a certain way. And there may be some truth to it in reality as well. You know, there might be. But for the most part, we should think much more about what the fold equity is like here compared to what the solver thinks it is, not care about the one big blind swing between betting this hand and not betting this hand in game theory. So with that all said and done, we do get picked off here and we run into sort of the top of villain's range, the pocket aces, which did slow play pre, and yeah, they got us this time. They slow played all the way down and they stacked us, but that's going to happen if you're never experiencing this kind of empty feeling of being stacked and bluffing it off into the nutted part of your opponent's range. It really means that you're not applying enough pressure to the weaker hands in your opponent's range and not capitalizing enough on a spot where fold equity is at a premium. It's actually higher than it's supposed to be. When I say supposed to be, meant to be, should, ought to, I'm really talking about villain compared with the GTO. It's not that they always want to copy GTO or play like a solver, but I do want to show you and illuminate the imbalances in their games, you know, the situations where they deviate from that, because those are the very spots that we get to exploit. So let's have a look at this in Pile Solver now, and I'll show you exactly what I mean and why I think this is a winning play, even though the solver says we shouldn't do it. So taking this one from the top, guys, we have the action sequence here in Pile Solver. So villain will go right back to the start of the hand. The root, as it's called, should check everything over to us on the flop, and we should bet everything. You can tell I didn't force the solver to bet here because it's not 100% bet, it's only 99.98. At 0.02% is extremely important. If you're not mixing that check into your game, you are exploitable, guys. You're going to get wrecked. Be careful. Check that often. You have to. GTO says you have to. Okay, jokes aside, the Queen of Clubs comes on the turn, and I just want to show you what a ridiculously high EV card this is for our range. So the pot here actually contains 623 chips at this point, right? We can see that there. And if we look at in position EV, we are entitled, our range that is entitled to 435 of those chips, of those 623 chips. That is a lot of chips. 435 chips. Whenever you're entitled to 2/3 of the pot, you are doing rather well. And I just want to stress how unusual that is after an action sequence like betting the flop and being called. Because what does it do when we bet the flop? It means that our opponent has had to contract their range to continue. And if you look at the hands they're folding here, it's going to be the very worst stuff. It's actually the stuff that brute force connects with that queen the hardest. So if you imagine that the ranges are really lopsided, like really asymmetrical here, our range is going to be containing far more combos of that high up stuff. If you have a look at it here, we have pocket queens, aces, kings. We just have way more combos of good hands here. Ace, queen, king, queen, the very hands that villain mostly pitched on the flop. Whereas our opponent, when they face this small bet again, is going to be in a world of pain. They're going to have a lot of hands like sixes, eights, nines, tens. And not only do they have those hands, but those hands make up a really significant part of their range, but they make up basically none of our range. So range advantage or disadvantage is not just about having more of the very best hands. That's what we call nut advantage. It's also about having less of the diabolical hands. And loads of villains' range that was kind of struggling but sort of surviving on the flop has been made into a hand that's barely coping. It's now 0 EV, it's just in a world of pain on this turn card. So that's why we want to bet really often here. That's why we don't need to be fussy. And even a hand that comes across as quite lousy does better by betting than checking. A hand like Ace 4 actually has some stuff going for it. It has some fold equity. It unblocks the pocket pairs that are folding. It has an overcard, which can be live if villain calls again with something like tens or king queen. And there's just no reason not to apply a ton of pressure here and bluff again. So I think one mistake a lot of you may make in this spot is that you're searching for ace king or ace 10 or king 10 to bet here, and while hands like that are okay to bluff with, you can see the solver is betting again with most of the ace king combos, barring this weird anomaly of ace of clubs, king of hearts. We are supposed to also fire tons of stuff. Ace X is actually a staple of our bluffing range here, and guess what? If we don't find those hands, we don't actually have enough air to go around. There aren't enough combos of nothing here for us to say, oh no, do you know what? I actually want to check ace 4 because it's not good enough. Paradoxically, ace 10 and king 10 are actually doing way more checking. King 10, in fact, is what we call a danger zone hand, where if we bet here, we get jammed on by the out of position opponent, by the preflop caller of the 4-bet, often enough that it actually completely erodes the EV of betting this hand. Danger zone here in the Carrot Poker School, you can check that out on carrotcorner.com, refers to stack size and how often you're going to face a shove for the remainder of the stack after you bet. And a hand like King 10 is actually going to be suffering greatly when it gets jammed on, and because of the low SPR, even though you have a range advantage and nut advantage here, villain is still going to jam sometimes over your bet, and when that does happen, most notably it happens with ace queen or aces or king queen or something like that, it's really going to hurt, it's going to sting, you're going to have your equity, your EV reduced to 0, even though you were doing really well by checking. So the only hand, in fact, that you're not allowed to reopen the action with and bluff on this turn card is one like this. Okay, as played, we get the 8 of hearts river. This is where the solver gets a bit picky, and it's like, you know what, if you've got blockers to both ace queen and king queen, because you hold ace king, you are able to bet the river for kind of like a 1 big blind swing. What you need to understand here is that the pot has 100 big blinds in it by this point. 1,035 chips, actually 103.5 big blinds in it. Therefore, a swing of 1 big blind is noise. It's nothing. It's going to get wiped out by the real situation, by how people play, by the way that humans are different to solvers. All that sort of thing is going to completely eradicate the truth behind Pio's estimation that it's, you know, 1 or 4 or 3 big blinds better to bet with certain suits. What's really likely to be the case here is that either all of these bets are winning as a bluff with ace king and ace 4 alike, even though they're different as a 3 or 4 big blind swing. Actually, in real life, either they're all going to be winning or they're all going to be losing. So just to help you understand the numbers here, this is a 5-10 game. So when the solver says that you lose 11 chips by betting, it thinks you lose 1 big blind. So it thinks with my hand, ace 4 of spades specifically, that betting is a big blind worse than checking in a pot of 100 big blinds. Very subject to being totally meaningless in the grand scheme of things, where real life fold equity is what truly matters. So if we do go ahead and go all in here, the very important question, and in fact the way I was able to derive that betting here was good and was right and something you guys should certainly do all of the time with ace 4 is the response. Because look how often villain is meant to defend with 10s, 9s, ace jack, never meant to fold the queen. Some people will do that. Believe it or not, some of your opponents are that scared, they're that tight that this can happen, especially at lower micro stakes like 10 and L, 25 and L, against tight players that think that their opponents aren't bluffing them. And maybe they're right, you know, maybe they're right to make big folds in many spots against their average opponent. But if you're pulling the trigger here on bluffs at a really high frequency, you're going to decimate the people that don't want to call down with a pair of queens, a pair of jacks that never want to call with an under pair. You're going to make their life miserable, and you're going to pillage a ton of that beautiful, juicy red line that we all seek, that we all crave. and you're going to do incredibly well. So don't worry about the verdict here. Don't go straight to what the solver's doing and be like, oh no, I need ace-4 of clubs to bet here, not ace-4 of spades. Imagine trying to grow as a poker player from that assertion that you need clubs instead of spades. Imagine trying to unpack that in a meaningful way and thinking that that's the difference. That's the thing that's stopping you beating 10NL. The thing that's stopping beating 10NL is rake. Rake is absolutely hideous at these stakes. That's a huge thing. But the other thing that's stopping you beating these stakes mainly is the fact that you're not pulling the trigger on enough aggression. You're not finding the right line in certain spots where one line is much better than the other, regardless of what the solver thinks. And I think this is a spot where, by using the solver's explanation of why we shouldn't bluff, that we're getting called by 9s and 10s at a reasonable frequency, we actually get to figure out that bluffing is the very thing that we should do here. So it's kind of ironic and paradoxical, isn't it, that you can actually take the solver telling you off and turn it into ammunition to justify your play. The key is going to the next node on the game tree and looking at how villain is allegedly meant to react and asking yourself, do I think they react that way or not? Do I think they're calling these hands at these frequencies? Or do I think they're overfolding here? I think they're usually overfolding, especially at lower stakes. Let's have a look at another spot now. So the main meat of this video was the hand we just looked at. I wanted to talk a lot about bluffing off stacks today and how you should be feeling that burn. Another way though that you can feel burn in poker is getting it in with the best hand and then getting sucked out on. I'm sure we've all been there as well. This is a thing that the nits among you will be way more accustomed to than the feeling I just showed you there, where a bluff gets snapped by the top of villain's range. So we have pocket aces, we go for the slightly bigger 3-bet. I'm going to rattle through the next few hands a bit faster because, like I say, they're more there for filler content, for just the fact that they're interesting and entertaining, and not so much that I'm going to deep dive them like I did that first one. So I think a mix of thorough analysis and then just quicker hand review is good for YouTube content. Let me know what you think in the comments, what formats you prefer. Okay, so we go for the small c-bet here. We're big blind against cutoff, so we started out with a bit more of a polarized range. Played this hand on stream and I actually said I want to bet really often on a board like this, even when I'm big blind. So even when my range is more polar pre, a lot of my bluffs pre-flop here are going to be offsuit kings, suited kings, that sort of thing. So this board is not just good for my value range, you know, for my king queen, king jack, suited, ace king, not king jack suited actually, that's probably just a bit too loose for value in this spot. But most of my offsuit king x, really big king x, pocket aces are thriving, but also my bluffing range is thriving because I may well go ahead with the king 4 suited here, king 5, king 6, do a bit of 3-bet pre, and of course we're doing very well with those hands on this texture. So high betting frequency, you can use big bets here as well, that's totally fine. If you want to use B60, I think the nut advantage that you have in this spot is sufficient for that sizing. You can also just go ahead and bet smaller though. Villain calls, we get the 10 of diamonds turn. So this is an interesting situation where we have this double flush draw scenario. And double flush draw is really interesting because what it means is that villain is just going to have a lot more middling equity draw hands than they would on a more rainbow or difficult to connect with a draw, in the sense of having a draw kind of board. So this is certainly a spot where we can check in theory. I think with the ace of spades, like, we are allowed to check here and sort of look to optimize against the weaker parts of villain's range, the floats that are going to bluff now. I think in practice, people are going to be very showdown, check back focused here. I don't actually expect them to bet as often as the solver does in this spot. And so I decided that betting here was just a way to maximize EV on a double flush draw board where most of our fold equity is in some sense useful. You know, if villain folds ace queen here, that's okay for us. I'm not too bothered about that. If they folded something like queen jack, that would be fantastic. If they want to continue with all kinds of draws, king x, etc., that's great too. So I figured that given I thought there was going to be under bluffing if I checked, and this is a very common thing we discuss in cash injection, where villain has filtered their range. We talk about the difference between a filtered range and an unfiltered range, which one's going to overbluff, which one's going to underbluff. Typically, sneak preview time, the filtered range that's already called a bet, even a small one, is going to be more likely to underbluff later, whereas the unfiltered range that's just been checked to, or it's just been very wide pre-flop out of the small blind or something, is going to be inclined to overbluff in the hands of an unskilled player. So here, because villain has filtered, I don't expect him to bluff very often when I check, compared to what the solver would. I think the solver might turn pocket sevens into like a sort of denial and bluff oriented bet here. I don't think humans do that as frequently. So I decided to bet and just max out on the value. Whenever you have a hand that's kind of optional in theory, but you have a reason to prefer one line in practice, you should just take that line rather than thinking about frequencies or getting bogged down with that. Villain jams, and I think like this is a bit weird. You'll see some jams here from semi-bluffs like ace jack and diamonds. We obviously block the ace-x of spade ones, but there are enough other semi-bluffs here that villain can have. And I think what some people will do here on double flush draw is kind of level themselves a bit with a hand like king-queen, maybe just jam already. I'm not sure if that's good here. I think out of position it really would be. So we call. Villain did actually have king-queen. They got there on the river. They sucked out on us. The queen of diamonds was sort of bad news, not really the river you want to see there. And we feel a different kind of burn from that of the first hand, where actually we just run into that small part of the game tree where they're going to suck out. I mean, it happens, 17. What was the actual equity there at the point of all in? So at the point of all in, it's like 11% it's saying. So very slim pickings, obviously villains, and a bit of a gross spot getting it in with this hand against our particular holding. But yeah, you're going to lose them sometimes. And how do you move on from this? Like, you've played the hand well, you've put a lot of thought into it. Maybe you're playing live and you've been waiting around for ages just to pick up a hand like pocket aces and get into this spot. It's been 3 hours of downtime, folding, drinking cups of tea, ordering, I don't know, the octopus starter from the Hippodrome in London like I like to do, or whatever you do when you're waiting on some action. And then this happens, and you're like, shit, I've just done nothing for 3 hours now, I've been stacked, and it's not even my fault. Fuck this game. That may be what you think. Fuck this game, I don't want to play this game. This game is unfair. That's not fair. It is actually completely fair in the long term, but nevertheless, it's going to trigger this feeling of injustice in the short term. And the easiest way to deal with it is not to actually fight it. Your brain's instinct here is to become angry. And what is anger? Anger is a response, it's a defensive mechanism, it's a fight, tilt response to adversity. It's basically a rejection of a certain state of affairs. So by getting angry, your brain, not by your own choice, but subconsciously, is choosing to resist the state of affairs that's been imposed upon you and is trying to prevent further infringements of this type. But you can't do that with poker. You can't get angry and ensure that that never happens again. For example, if a friend of mine insults me really badly, is super rude to me, hurts my feelings, I can maybe say to them, I'm really pissed off at you, I'm angry, don't do that to me again or our friendship's going to be in trouble. And I can use anger as a way of ensuring better future outcomes for both of us and for our friendship, just to take a more personal analogy there. In poker though, the thing we're trying to reject or push away or change in future by being angry is unchangeable. Like, there will always be situations where this happens to you, regardless of how mad you get. So you really need to resist the temptation to get mad here. And although your initial instinct will be anger and disappointment and bitterness and injustice and all of these things, letting that wash over you relatively quickly by acknowledging it and actually reminding yourself that there's a better way to interpret this, which is just that it doesn't really matter whether I win or lose today. Whether you go home from the casino, on the subway, having won or having lost, doesn't matter. Whether you log off your computer and go downstairs for the night, having won or having lost won't matter ultimately if you're doing everything right and you're working on your game. However, it can matter greatly if you let it matter. So it's up to you. Do you want to let anger and sort of rage against variance embody you? And do you want that to become your ingrained natural reaction? Or do you want to fight it and do you want to practice a healthier, more versatile reaction that will keep you afloat in poker long term? It's much easier to survive in poker if you can react here with a bit of grace and acceptance rather than in a bratish tantrumy sort of way. Ask yourself, how do you react to this river and how can you improve it based on this conversation? Okay, hopefully that was a useful little tangent. Let's do one more hand before we bring this video to a close. Okay, after that big barrage of mental game coaching and sort of life advice for poker players, and after that big technical dive, we're going to wrap up with something a little bit more small pot oriented, something that you'll face more and more as you come across stronger and stronger opposition. So this hand will be really useful for those of you playing a little bit higher or looking to move up to spots where you may be playing against professionals and really serious poker players and stuff like this, but hopefully it'll still be interesting for those of you playing micro and low stakes too. We have a 2.25 BB open from cutoff here at 200 zoom. Strong player, Welsh Gaz, plays pretty well overall from what I've seen, though I don't know loads about their game. We decide to call this time in the big blind with Queen Jack off. You could also throw in a sort of 3-bet bluff here and it would be all right. Jack 9-4, we check, they go for pot. So the reason I picked this hand out is I think that facing pot here is something that those of you playing lower won't really encounter much, and therefore when you do move up and start playing against tougher players that have strategies based on making your life hard, strategies based on leading you into a spot where you're less comfortable and less familiar and therefore more likely to make mistakes. When you face this sort of sizing then, your opponent will know this part of the game tree better than you will, They've kind of led you into their forest that they know like the back of their hand, and you don't know this forest because you didn't grow up here and you've never really traversed these paths. So this is where you can lose a lot of EV if you're not careful, because your opponent just knows the spot better than you do. So first off, what is something that changes when you face a near pot size bet instead of 1/3? The most obvious answer, you can pause the video here if you want, but the most obvious answer is the polarization of your opponent's range. It's not that their range will be stronger per se in terms of equity or EV, but they will have a higher percentage of really nutted hands in their range, like aces, kings, queens, nines, ace, jack, king, jack, fours, jack 9, and they'll have a lower frequency of hands like 8s, 10s, weak jack X, 10, 9, queen 9, etc. In fact, they'll have very little at all of the latter group, which are sort of polarization mistakes with a sizing they're too mediocre, in other words, to bet this size. So when we face this c-bet, the right thing for us to do is call this hand. It's actually blocking a lot of villains' value bets, it's blocking their high EV draws, it has backdoor equity. It's an incredibly good call. It's much higher EV to call this sizing than it is to fold, and raising is something we need to do a bit more selectively against the pot size c-bet. Villain checks back, and this is where our range is super interesting, because if you're not careful here, you're going to actually overbluff this spot. I figured this out after a bit of deliberation. Not with this hand, of course. This hand is a value candidate, not a bluff candidate, but let's think about why it might be easy to overbluff here. So again, pause the video if you want to figure that out for yourself, but the answer is that because villain is really polarized here, you have no incentive to go ahead and bet hands like 9x or weak jack X. Maybe you can bet queen jack, it's fringy, it's debatable, but you have no incentive to go for thin value when your opponent has polarized to a value range of mostly top pair plus, and then over pairs, etc., better hands, and then just airballs. Or maybe they bluff with a 7 and now hit trips. So this is a very polarizing spot for your opponent, even though they check back the turn, and you might see that as a condensing action, and it is. Their range is way more polarized than it would be had they bet 1/3 pot on the flop. That means that you have to value bet much more thinly. In fact, you don't have very many hands here that you're able to value bet, because a lot of your 7x folded flop, your 4s or 9s or whatever raised flop, and your bad jacks are not really good enough to value bet here. So what I would suggest is you could either play around with some really small sizes and value bet more thinly for small blocks, or you could get into the habit of just realizing that in order to actually not overbluff here, you have to do a lot of raising earlier with your draws. So you can raise a bunch of your draws earlier on the flop to make sure that you don't end up with way too many of them drowning on the river here in air hands. You could argue that maybe because of that, I can value bet this hand big and get called really lightly sometimes by ace high and stuff like that, but I still think it's going to be difficult for villain to have many showdown value-y weak payoff hands in their range here, given the 7 paired on the river, and that they're not really betting 8s or something on the flop for that sizing. Therefore, we want to check, because their range remains a lot more polar than ours does. Villain checks back, doesn't go for it this time with king 10, but hands like this and then hands that beat us are going to be the main part of their range on the river. Therefore, some hands that look like obvious value bets are actually verging on being too thin, and we really want to take into account here the difference in ranges that this pot size c-bet creates, and then trace that all the way through the hand and act on it on the river. That's what really strong poker players do. If you like the way we teach the game here at Carrot Corner Poker Education, don't forget to check out our Twitch channel and also our paid content on carrotcorner.com. We have 2 courses right now that are really our main sellers on the site. We have the theoretical voyage of the Carrot Poker School, taking your game from no theory at all or some confused ideas about poker theory into being an absolute beast of theory and understanding everything. It's a fully comprehensive course. Then we also have our exploitative course, Cash Injection, which is more about finding spots to really punish pull in, like we did in the first hand of today's video. Stay tuned for more videos. Don't forget to subscribe. It really helps the channel, as well as notifies you when the videos are coming out. But here's a clue. They're every Wednesday and every Friday, twice a week, here on YouTube. I will see you for the next one very soon, and good luck at the tables, guys. Bye for now.